John 20:24 through 26. But Thomas, one of the 12, called Didymus, was not with them when Jesus came. The other disciples therefore said unto him, We have seen the Lord. But he said unto them, Except I shall see in his hands the print of the nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and thrust my hand into his side, I will not believe. After 8 days again, his disciples were... All right. Bible Smack. Okay, so today I am responding to a video. Harvard Philologist says no historical Jesus. All right. So, just giving a couple basic responses. Guy's name is Carl A.P. Rock. As a philologist, he's basically giving his theories about the past. And he believes that, this is all, that the Bible is completely mythology, and, they just basically had these secret apocalyptic meanings, but, no reality there. And they would just dress up stuff with mythology, and that's just what they must have done with the Bible. And a lot of times they did this while, they get high as a kite. But honestly, I'm looking over this picture, and this old dude, he looks high as a kite. I can be a little bit mangy, okay? My hair is clean, but I didn't really get to comb it right after you showered. Anyway. But no, this guy's really mangy. And he just really comes off like he's some guy at the bar who doesn't have a life anymore. And so he's just kind of, getting drunk and not really have anything fun to do with life, other than, waste away. But apparently he is got a Harvard PhD. And what that says to me is that Harvard as a scholastic institution is crap. Okay? I mean, they're just, they really lost all credibility a good 15, 20 years ago. And, if you want your kid to go there, you're an idiot. You're going to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars. So this person is against everything that God stands for and against everything America stands for. And at the end of the day, you're wicked, might be wealthy if you get through. You might not get through, but you're definitely going to pay. So, no, I think that Harvard is worthless at this point. And here's the proof. When we start talking about the mythology and the mythicism, we're really talking about another version of Gnosticism. Gnosticism was a heresy that the early Christians were fighting as early as the very end of the New Testament. And one of the groups, they would split up spiritual things from physical things. They're called docetists. But they would then ignore physical things. So it's not a surprise that some of these modern Gnostics are getting lured into the Jesus mythicism conspiracy. Most textual criticism is conspiracy theory. They think, here are the facts. We don't like the facts. We'll make up our own facts. That's conspiracy theory. Okay. You don't have anything like, Jesus is just a normal human being and everything's okay. Unless you're going into some sort of wild source. There were several Gnostic Gospels, but what they don't tell you is that was about 200 to 300 years after the fact. Okay? They want to talk about, we've got 40 or 50 years of Gospel. or 40, 50 years after Jesus died, the first gospel was made. That's a lie. But let's go ahead and I'll try to respond to these, the way they're presented in the video. I'm still kind of I'm getting the basics here, but at the same time, it's just very obvious. I have more respect for a flat earther than I do a Jesus mythicist, okay, because there's just no truth in it. It's just conspiracy. Make it look like it's political manipulation. All right, Charlie P. Rock looks a little odd. He's got this theory about, drugs and psychedelics. Junkie. Okay. But more serious than that. He says there's no physical remains of Christ. False. And he made a joke about, well, I'm sure we've got Jesus' foreskin, and there are churches that are showing that off. Those are typically Catholic style churches that are pagan, like you. So I don't really put a lot of stock in credibility in that. Occasionally they did accidentally find something that might actually be scientifically valid, but not often. Now, what do we have any physical remains? Well, obviously Jesus' body ascended to heaven. But there were things left here. One was the Shroud of Turin. Now, they made fun of that and they said, oh, well, didn't they prove that was nothing but from the 14th century? Okay. And one of the world's oldest internet websites is Shroud.com. So you can go there and you can study all this stuff, okay? But long story short is in 2006, I think it was Roy Rogers, a scientist proved, that this was false. And who was he? He was one of the guys who came up with a date to begin with. In other words, they would carbon date it, and they said, well, it's in the 1400s. But later on, what they found was that the stitching that they gathered was on the very edge of the shroud. And so when they gathered that, there was a lot of stitching that was not original or authentic. What that is that somewhere in those 1400s, there was a fire and pieces of the shroud got singed. So then nuns would take cotton and they would sew it into the fabric to keep the shroud together. Now, it just seems to me like they probably should have known that going in. But what can you do? However, Roy Rogers did publish a peer-reviewed paper showing that was what the case was. These were microscopic cotton filaments that they had taken out that were mixed in with these 14, 15, 1600 nun stitchings. Okay. However, the shroud has a lot of credentials. Number one, there's a painting of the shroud from 900 AD. Okay. Number two, the stitching they found to be of Israeli descent. And this was first century. Okay, it was a first century stitch pattern and things like that. And of course, we've traced a little bit of the shroud's history. It was first found, okay, and when I say found, what do I mean? I mean that since it was gone, because there was a record of this shroud around, and of course it's from the Bible. But they had found this in Liry, France, okay? And Liry, France is near the Seine River. And that gets to another story, which I'm going to say in a minute. But there's also another artifact they found that's on another part of the world. In North Africa, they found originally a sudarium, the sudarium of Oviedo, which is the face cloth. In the Bible, it talks about how there's a shroud, which was for burial, and a face cloth that they would use during the crucifixion to keep people from seeing his marred, disgusting form. So essentially, when they looked at the Siderium, they first found that in the 5th century. However, the shroud had stains on it, and the stains matched the cuts that were on the shrouded turret. Now, another thing that's interesting is that the holes in the shroud were of nails going through the wrist, and yet most English readers would say it's nails going through the hands. But the ancients used to consider your wrist upward to be your hand. Okay. So it knew this historical fact. How? Because it was part of the history. Well, anyhow, they found 114 places where the Siderium and the Shroud matched. Then they found a door or a rock disc that would be slid in front of a burial tomb. And it was called the Great Stone of Mount Nebo. Now, the Great Stone of Mount Nebo, that matches what we see in the Gospels, that it wasn't just a regular stone that was rolled in front of the tomb. It was a great stone, probably about 9 feet in length, about 15 inches wide. They had 2 competing tombs. The first tomb was dedicated to Constantine's mother, and it really didn't have any evidence for it, but a lot of people would run to that conclusion. The second one was around the hill of Calvary on another side, and it was called the Garden Tomb. A couple feet from the Garden Tomb, there was what do they call it when you have a quarry, and the quarry had 2 eyes and a nose and a mouth, and so that was called Skull Hill, which reminds us of what? Mount Calvary, Golgotha. So the Great Stone of Mount Nebo matched in the measurements to the Garden Tomb. When you get into the Garden Tomb, there is a tomb for a man that is 5 foot 8 inches. But then there's an engraving of 3 extra inches for a man to be 5, 10, or 11. The Gospels tell us that that was Joseph of Arimathea, and that Christ would then take up his tomb. Well, the Shroud of Turin has the length of a man of 5, 10, 11. Just right. Just perfectly fitting. Some other evidence that we've gathered over the years. Caiaphas, in his tomb, they found these nails, and they believe that Caiaphas was keeping the nails for the simple fact that he knew that Jesus had risen from the dead, and they must have belonged to Jesus. That one I'm not as secure in, but, a lot of people do verify that. Another thing was that you had the ossuary of James. Now, this was discovered in the early 2000s. The Israeli Historical Society went to debunk it, but then that got debunked in peer-reviewed literature a couple years later. So now Jesus has a brother. How could he be the brother of Jesus if Jesus is a myth? Okay, so we do have lots of physical evidence that Jesus existed. Now, let's see here. Another big claim is that Christianity is a Hellenistic religion. And so, if it's a Hellenistic religion, then it's basically pagan And, my question is, why would they throw the Christians to the Romans? Why would they call them dogs and every other bad name there is if they had the same type of religion that they did? Why were they calling the Christians atheists? Why were they calling them cannibals because of the Lord's Supper? If it was an acceptable, Gentile religion, then it would be liked by the Gentiles, but it wasn't. Christianity was predominantly Jewish for the first several centuries. Let's see here. And then, of course, the Gnostic Gospels, they're wanting to compete with this. They don't really complain until years later. Now, along with this mythicism idea, they want to say that all these stories of pagan gods are therefore stories of Jesus and that Jesus was made up. And what you find is, and Mike Winger has I think he calls it copycats, but he's got a video talking about all these different alternatives they made up to say that, okay, these myths had everything. I mean, the first question is where is the pagan scripture? A lot of what we find is stuff that's written centuries and centuries after the fact. They don't have a set version of scripture. In fact, they change the stories quite often. So, that's kind of what goes on there. Is you have this fake stuff, or like that demigod is going to get some Christianized version, years after the fact. Okay, parallels. We find prophetic fulfillment of scriptures all over the Bible. We find all these ingenious connections. And, they just assume that that's impossible. So what they do is they say, oh, you see, it's fake because they're referring to each other. Instead of like saying, hey, some of the stuff has been fulfilled and the other person passed on. This is real. The real roots of paganism comes from the Tower of Babel, where man would make a name unto himself, and all the pagan religions descended from it. They altered religion. And at the time, they didn't have Bibles, but they could look up at the stars, find a gospel message within the stars. Talk about the resurrection. They keep on acting like they're talking about the resurrection, but they're actually talking about reincarnation. I mean, you don't have a story in the Bible where somebody gets corn planted and out comes little pop. Agriculture. They start finding patterns of agriculture in the Bible and other pagan traditions. Well, if they're finding all this stuff, are they making it up on their own, or have they been given a pattern or to eat or not to eat? As they lose the idea of common sense, and they have to become hypocrites like they're claiming Christians are. They'll say they don't want to kill anything, so they become vegans. Then they have to kill something because you got to pay for your food. You got to help make your food. And animals keep on dying. Plants die. It goes about the plants. So then they start talking about sacrificial rituals. And they'll talk about all these Gentile groups sacrificing, doing blood sacrifice and so on. Well, they claim that the Christian religion is just Gentiles, and they have something to do with sacrifice. The problem is that the Jews do blood sacrifice. So, no, that doesn't prove anything. And of course, we hear about. Alright, so this kind of wore me out a little bit, but I think you see now, a lot of this stuff is just good. I mean, we've got tons of historians. I've got a lot more archaeology to talk about. I'm just too tired. But essentially, you know, if you got all this mangy stuff, it's just like, that's somebody who really saved you. How about somebody who